First of all, well, thank you so much for your kind words and your support over the last 13 years now. And it is my pleasure to share this webinar with all of you. And first, my declaration of interest. I've been working for the National Health Service in Spain over the last 30 years. That means I'm a civil servant and paid by the government, my province government. I have no funding from drug companies. And from 2020 to 2021, I spent 1 year, as Dr. Perry already said, at UBC working on a project to restore a clinical trial that was funded by the University of Maryland in Baltimore, USA. So this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'll give you an overview on the information flowchart from clinical trials to publication. Then I'll give you a briefing about regulatory documents, what is available, what is not for researchers. Then we'll discuss for a short while about the importance of completing the picture of drug assessment through individual patient data. But we'll mainly focus our attention on the information from the clinical study report and how helpful this information can become to complete the picture. And for this, we'll use as an example the restoration of the Fourier trial, which is a very large and important trial. And then the conclusions. So regarding to the information flowchart, as you may already know, whenever a clinician is taking part of a clinical trial, the very first document they will fill in is the case report form. This means that whenever a relevant event happens in the trial, heart attack or whatever information it is, this will be written down in this case report form that nowadays, obviously, this is in electronic format. Out of this information, an individual patient data set will be made. In the case of the Fourier trial, this accounts for over 27,000 patients. And out of this data set, a very important document will be made, which is the clinical study report. There's a lot of clinical information in here. And in the case of this trial, this accounts for over 50,000 pages. And out of this clinical information, publication will be made that will be published in medical journals. So the very first thing we should think of is that this incredibly large information, clinical information that accounts for over 50,000 pages, will shrink, so to say, into a 9-page document. This means that a lot of important information will be left out. And but what most people will read and most people will base their decisions on is the medical journal publication. If we go back in this slide, we go back to the clinical study report, we can tell that nowadays this information is becoming more and more available, though not fully available, but this is becoming more and more. If we go back to the data set, we can tell that this is hardly available, but in some cases you can get access to it. Take, for example, that in the United States, according to the law, researchers can claim for this information, the data set, for all cases of trials that were funded, even though partially funded with public funds. We have got access to some of these data sets for our research work, and this is highly valuable. And if we get back to the case report form, we can tell that we never get this information, but it would be really important to do it. Why? Well, because first of all, we have no guarantee that the information in the case report form, that is the primary information in the clinical trial, is faithfully transcribed into the dataset. And from time to time, you can read things like this. In this case, this is a report by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, on a drug called apixaban, an anticoagulant. And the reviewer raises his concerns about discrepancies between the trial database and the data collected on the electronic case report form. So this may happen. There's evidence that this is happening, but we couldn't tell to what extent this is a matter of concern or not. Likewise, we have no idea about if the information in the dataset is faithfully transcribed into the case report form, and from the case report form, from the clinical study report to the publication. Since nowadays we're getting more and more access to this clinical study report, we can tell if there's any discrepancies between the publication in the medical journal and the information in this clinical study report. And obviously, there will be much more additional information in the clinical study report than that in the journal publication. And if we get access to the individual patient data, we can proceed the same way and double check if any discrepancies between the database and the publication in the medical journal. And obviously, there will be a lot of more additional information in the data set. So, having said so, we can say that regulators usually speak about the common technical documents, and they include the clinical study report as one of the main important documents to evaluate drugs. And as I was saying before, the case report forms are not really available. The EMA and Health Canada never require this information from the companies. That means they won't be able to double check if the primary information from the trial is faithfully transcribed to all reports. In the case of the FDA, they do require this information from the companies by default, but never use it. And that is a matter of concern too. And there's another important information, which is the inspection reports from regulators. You may already know that whenever a trial is conducted, there will be inspections to see if everything runs smoothly, if there's any problem in the trial, in the implementation of the trial, or whatever. Well, this information is hidden, but just a few months ago, for the first time ever, there was a regulator, namely Health Canada, that started publishing the results of inspections of clinical trials. And this is highly valuable and very important. This is the website of Health Canada, where you can find information about clinical trial inspections. You can go through non-compliant clinical trial inspections. You can go through the whole of it. And in the case of, well, this is the the first, well, the way the website looks like, and you have information about the sponsor, the region where the trial was carried out, the inspection start date, drug trial phase, and rating at inspection. And this is the case, for example, of a non-compliant trial. And here you can read the problems the inspectors detected that had to do with labeling, with recording information. You can read all the problems they recorded. And the conclusion of this inspection was that they decided to suspend the authorization for the clinical trial in its entirety and propose corrective actions that are pending. You can see in the right column that for every trial, you'll see the rating, and you can see if they're compliant, the inspection is in progress, they were not non-compliant, whatever. And this is highly valuable. One of the problems about this is that, yeah, this is only for Canada. So, and usually all trials are carried out worldwide, and we have no idea about the results of inspections in other places than Canada. So it would be very important that all the rest of regulators follow the path of their Canadian colleagues and start publishing all this information, which is highly important. Well, regarding individual patient data, just a couple of slides just to let you know the importance of this information. Well, this, as an example, this is the case of Cochrane review we worked on. We wanted to learn whether lowering blood pressure below standard thresholds was beneficial for patients with hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So in 2017, we concluded that for most outcomes, there was no benefit in lowering the blood pressure beyond standards. But for one outcome, we found that there was small absolute reduction in total cardiovascular serious adverse events. That means for serious adverse events outcome, there was a small benefit, right? But once we obtained the individual patient data, we realized we were wrong. And the trial had been misreported. And if we consider the whole picture, the whole information, we had to take it back and conclude that there was no difference between groups in any outcome. So there was no potential benefit of lowering blood pressure beyond standards, standard BP blood pressure. And this is another example of the things you can do if you have individual patient data. This is another Cochrane review we're working on. In fact, we have already submitted it. It is under editorial process. And we want to learn about the blood pressure targets for people with hypertension and chronic renal disease. Since we had access to individual patient data, we could retrieve renal patients and then see about the results of lowering blood pressure to a greater extent in this kind of population. So we can use individual patient data for correcting information or generate new information, which is very important too. But okay, now let's go to the clinical study report and things we can do with all this information. And for this, as I was telling you before, we'll use as an example the registration of the Fourier trial. First, I'll give you a brief description of the trial. Then I will justify why the Fourier trial and why this trial is so important. We'll see what information can we obtain from the publication of the trial in the New England Journal of Medicine. Then I will explain how we applied for regulatory documents of this trial. We'll see what the clinical study report can let us know at first sight. Then how and why we applied for a restoration project. We decided to restore that trial. And then I will let you know about how we did it, methods and results, right? So let's go through the description of the trial. This was the typical trial, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multicentric, that was carried out in a population aged 40 to 85 years with evident cardiovascular disease, with so-called high cholesterol levels, in spite of treatment with statins, with or without sedative. The intervention was evolocumab that could be given twice per month or once per month. And the primary outcome of this trial was a composite outcome of cardiovascular mortality, myocardial infarction, stroke, hospitalization for unstable angina, or coronary revascularization, right? It was a really large trial, as I already said, over 27,000 patients. And according to the protocol, the trial was expected to last for 58 months, more or less. But the trial was stopped halfway through, after 26 months of follow-up on average. So there was an early termination. Well, the conclusions of the authors of this trial was that the drug was very useful in lowering cholesterol, and it also reduced the risk of cardiovascular events. And they end up saying that we should lower cholesterol levels more than what the current targets say, and we should go more strict and more intense in our approach to cholesterol. So why the Fourier trial? Well, first, when this drug was launched onto the market, this was a new mechanism of action. This was the first in class, new drug class. The trial was really large, and this trial could be settling the evidence. Whenever you review the evidence of anything, if there's a trial that has so many patients, probably the trial will settle the evidence. And if this trial is distorted, our evidence and our conclusions will also be distorted. And another important reason is that there was such a big drop in cholesterol levels that if we believe in the cholesterol theory, we should expect a huge impact on clinical outcomes out of treating patients with this drug, right? So let's go through the New England publication. Let's see what is in there. Well, first, I think it's important to note that after the trial had already been started, the company decided to make some amendments that probably influenced results to a great extent. First, they said that they wanted to clarify that all-cause death, myocardial infarction, stroke, revascularization, hospitalization for unstable angina, hospitalization for heart failure, and transit ischemic attack will not be considered as serious adverse events in this study, but instead will be handled as efficacy endpoints. And you may think, so what? Well, this is important because the consequence is that cardiovascular events are split into efficacy and safety outcomes, and this allows for selective reporting. For example, myocardial infarctions were reported as efficacy outcomes, but atrial fibrillation was tagged as a safety outcome, and it was unpublished in the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, we'll get back to this point later on. They also clarified that the company will review all fatal endpoints. There was a change in the secondary endpoint. Initially, this was hospitalization for worsening heart failure, and it was changed to cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure. The consequence was that heart failure events alone won't be published in the medical journal. And they also added a secondary endpoint that was ischemic fatal or non-fatal stroke or transient ischemic attack. Well, talking about the results, we can confirm that the impact in lowering cholesterol was huge, from 2.33 millimoles per liter. There was a big drop on average to 0.77 millimoles per liter. So there's no doubt that the lowering of cholesterol is highly effective if you give this drug to your patients. And according to the New England publication, the evolocumab group experienced 1.5% decrease in the primary endpoint. And so this was a positive result. But the thing is that cardiovascular death was increased, or numerically increased. There was no significant differences, but there was a 5% increase. And likewise, death from any cause was also increased in a 4%. So this is rather inconsistent because if the drug was effective to reduce cardiovascular events, it is rather rare that cardiovascular mortality was increased instead of decreased, right? If we take a look at the results in the primary composite endpoint, we could see that cardiovascular mortality was increased in the evolocumab group, myocardial infarction, stroke, and coronary revascularization was decreased, while hospitalization for unstable angina was same, more or less. There was no change. So this is rather inconsistent. We could think, is there any different, is the incidence of events reducing all outcomes? No. The behavior of the drug for all these different cardiovascular outcomes is strange. In a composite outcome, you expect that all individual outcomes are reduced more or less to the same extent, but this was not the case, and there was no consistency. In the New England publication, you can also read that the most frequent cardiovascular death cause was other causes, and this accounted for almost 76% of deaths. And this was really rare too, because most people die of myocardial infarction, stroke, and heart failure when it comes to cardiovascular causes. In the New England, we have no information about fatal or no fatal cases of heart failure. no information about heart failure alone. We don't have the full picture of cardiovascular events. They were not published in its integrity. Why? Because those tagged as efficacy outcomes were published in numbers in the New England publication. Let's say myocardial infarction, stroke, and all that. But these cases were not described in the clinical study report. We have no narratives. We cannot double check what happened. But for cases that cardiovascular events that were tagged as safety outcomes, like some cases, few cases of myocardial infarction, stroke, atrial fibrillation, unstable angina, and so on, we have no information in the New England publication, but in contrast, they are very well described in the clinical study report, though this information was never published. We don't get any information about the total serious adverse events in the New England publication. And we can tell that blinding was not really guaranteed, because you know, both patients and doctors had access to lab results. So though they were kindly invited not to look at the lab results, they could do it. And so they could guess, both patients and doctors, who was under evolocumab and who was under placebo. Well, and there's a lot of conflicts of interest. The main author of this trial, during the implementation of the trial, was paid some $146,000 US in terms of consulting fees from the company, most of it to promote evolocumab. And he also received from the company during these 2-3 years associated research funds worth over $11.5 million. So in spite of this, the main author declared having no conflicts of interest. But when we decided to restore the trial, and we mentioned that the conflicts of interest declaration should also be restored, that was April 2019. Then 2 months later, the main author decided to change his declaration and acknowledge he did have conflicts of interest. So then we decided to apply for regulatory documents. And as I was saying at the beginning of the session, the case report forms is the primary source of information in any clinical trial. So we decided to go for that and see if regulators were willing to give us this information. So we contacted the FDA, and they said that, okay, they hold this information and they get it on by default. But they also said that they would take them some 3 years to address the application and another 2-3 years to send the clinical study reports. I mean, sorry, the case report forms. Over 3 years already passed from this application, and so far we had no news from the FDA. We also contacted the EMA and Health Canada, and both of them said exactly the same. They let us know that they don't request this information, and once the indication is approved and after submission, they have no legal right to claim all this information to the companies, which is hard to believe, but looks like this is right. So we can tell that regulators, in general terms, don't make any effort to obtain this primary information from clinical trials. Well, but the good thing about it is that Health Canada promised us to release the clinical study report within 120 days. And so did they. And in less than 100 days, all this information was available in their website. So we went through the clinical study report. As I was saying before, there's a lot of clinical information, which is really worth reading. And what relevant information can we get out of it? Well, for example, we could read that the number of patients with at least one cardiac event, which was never published, was exactly the same between groups. There was no difference. So this means that out of almost 4,000 unpublished cardiac events tagged as safety outcomes, there was no difference between groups. So our question could be, is it consistent? This information with cardiovascular events tagged as efficacy outcomes being significantly lower in the evolocumab group? In other words, those cardiovascular outcomes unpublished and tagged as safety outcomes were so different from those tagged as efficacy outcomes. We could also see that there was some mismatching between the numbers of fatal myocardial infarction and stroke cases in the New England and versus the clinical study report. In the clinical study report, you can see very interesting information, that is the results across different regions. And if you compare Europe versus North America, you can see that in the composite outcome, that is the primary outcome, there was an important difference, which was statistically significant. In Europe, there was no benefit of the drug in the main outcome, no statistically significant differences. But in North America, it looks like the drug behaved in a very different way. If you take a look at the cardiovascular death outcome, same happened. In Europe, there was 23% increase in cardiovascular death. You may remember that according to the publication, there was overall 5% increase in cardiovascular mortality, but in Europe it was 23%, while in North America there was 35% decrease in mortality, cardiovascular mortality. So this is really weird. And this is the case of all-cause mortality too. In Europe, there was a 17% increase. In North America, a 25% decrease. Well, this is really inconsistent. If you take a look at the results according to subgroups, you can also see that in patients with prior myocardial infarction, the drug was not effective at all after 1 year of the myocardial infarction, which is also very inconsistent because this drug was supposed to work better in secondary prevention. And then we can take a look at the narratives. The narratives are a briefing of the clinical record of the patient. In this case, this is all about deaths, death narratives. You can see on top of the report, like a table, you can read adjudication. Adjudication means the cause of death. In this case, there was 3 possibilities: cardiovascular death, non-cardiovascular death, and undetermined death. And then on the right, you can read in bold adjudicated cause of death. That was the more detailed cause of death. Let's say myocardial infarction, sudden cardiac death, as this is the case. So, but you can see highlighted in yellow that this patient on day 88 had a myocardial infarction and died. However, the official cause of death was sudden cardiac. So we could see that this was a case of myocardial infarction death that was misreported as sudden cardiac death. And then you can see another case that is exactly the same situation: myocardial infarction misreported as sudden cardiac death. This is extremely rare. This is a case adjudicated as cardiovascular death, but then also adjudicated as non-cardiovascular death, trauma. But if you read the narratives, you can tell that this was a myocardial infarction in a patient who also experienced cardiac shock. This is a case of a patient who died in a road traffic accident that was adjudicated as a sudden cardiac death. The case of another myocardial infarction adjudicated as sudden cardiac death. So in more and more, we could see there were so many cases that were inconsistent. This is the case of a stroke that was adjudicated as sudden cardiac death as well. So this case of stroke was misreported, and so on. So since we saw so many inconsistencies, we decided to apply for a project. And what should you do if you want to apply for a RIAD project? Well, first, you must fill in a call to action. That means you should write to the British Medical Journal and say that you want to restore this trial because of this and that. And you explain very shortly your protocol and whatever you want to do. Then you have to contact authors at least 3 times. And if they don't reply to you, or they don't really want to restore the information, then you have the right to go through it and restore the trial. And third, you have to provide evidence that you hold enough information to do your job and restore the trial. And if all this is fulfilled, then you can apply for this. This is the case of the first restore trial ever, the so-called study 329. In the original publication, authors said that paroxetine and imipramine were very useful, effective, and safe in treating major depression in adolescents. But when these authors went through the clinical study report, they could see that these drugs were not safe nor effective for depression in adolescents. And this was published in the British Medical Journal. And in this very same journal, we published the call to action just to let people know that we wanted to restore a misreported trial on evolocumab. Well, and how did we do it? First, what we did was to review all the narratives of all death outcomes and serious adverse events. select cases for discussion, re-adjudicate endpoints if adequate. For this, we set up a committee to re-adjudicate events. That was our colleagues from UBC in Vancouver, from Therapeutics Initiative. And there was a validation committee in Spain that was my colleagues who supervised the decisions of the re-adjudication committee. And then we carried out the reanalysis. All this was recently published in the British Medical Journal, Open. And 1 month after publication, we could see that it was very nicely accepted, and it attracted a lot of attention from readers. It became top 1 in the BMJ Open rank, and it is scoring high, it's present. And what did we find? Well, what we found was first that as many as 26% of total deaths, we found inconsistencies between the adjudication and the adjudicated cause of death. This means that in cases where the death was said to be cardiovascular, at the same time, it was said to be undetermined or non-cardiovascular. Or in cases, as you can see here in green, non-cardiovascular deaths were said to be at the same time cardiovascular due to stroke, 28 cases, sudden cardiac deaths in 12 cases, undetermined 10 cases. And in blue, you can read those cases that were tagged as undetermined deaths, but at the same time, they were said to be cardiovascular deaths, sudden cardiac deaths in 91 cases, or non-cardiovascular deaths because of malignancy in 15 cases. So there was a lot of inconsistencies. And we published all this in the British Medical Journal article, and we included, you can see the right column that gives information about the clinical story report page where all this information can be found. So everybody can double check, go through the clinical story report, go to this page, and see that we're telling the truth. Well, and what else? In the information in the New England, we found that there was 25 deaths of myocardial infarction, 31 deaths out of stroke, and other causes accounted for 195 deaths. But after re-adjudication, that means when we went through the clinical story report and we double-checked the information, we could see that there were as many as 11 more cases of myocardial infarction than reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, and there was 8 less cases of stroke than reported in the New England. When it comes to the placebo group, if we compare the New England publication with the clinical study report, we could see that in the clinical study report, there was 3 less cases of acute myocardial infarction, and there was 8 less cases of stroke. And it is very important to note that well, the cases of sudden cardiac death were more or less the same between groups, but in the case of heart failure deaths, there was almost as much as double cases in the evolocumab group than in the placebo group, and this information was never published. That could give us a hint that some cardiac issues may be happening. Well, in the supplementary information in the BMJ open publication, we also included a list of all changes we made, and also gave enough information for anyone to double check that we're faithful to the information in the clinical story report. If you take, for example, case number 13, you can read that on page 23778, this patient was treated with evolocumab. The researcher, the clinician who treated the patient, said that he died out of acute myocardial infarction. It was adjudicated as a cardiovascular death, but the final adjudication was sudden cardiac death. Our comments were like the narratives read that the subject experienced acute myocardial infarction and died on the same day. And then we re-adjudicated this case as death cardiovascular due to an acute myocardial infarction. So everybody can read this, can go through the clinical story report and double check this information. One of the important things we learned is that there were many cases of undetermined death. You know something, whenever I read the reports of clinical trials published in medical journals, I was like, okay, I have the numbers of total mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and I would take for granted that the rest would be non-cardiovascular mortality. But I never knew that as many as 1/3 of deaths in the trial were undetermined. We have no idea about the cause of death of these patients. So one of my first conclusions was that we really need autopsies being carried out in clinical trials, because there are so many deaths that we have no idea about the cause of these deaths. And if we take the overall information and we split this information into cardiac and vascular deaths, we can see that cardiac deaths in the evolocumab group accounted for 113 cases, while it was 88 in the placebo group. So there's a clear imbalance, and there were more cases of myocardial infarction and heart failure. This was unpublished, as I was telling you before. It was the very same cases of sudden cardiac death, but not of myocardial infarction and heart failure. That means, well, some cardiac issues may be going on. And if we take a look at the vascular deaths, it was exactly the same number in both groups. So looks like no vascular issues, but probably some cardiac issues regarding this drug. In the BMJ publication, we said that we cannot exclude the possibility that evolocumab would have increased cardiovascular mortality significantly over the planned full trial duration, because the trial was stopped halfway through. And by the time the trial was stopped, if we go through the clinical story report and re-adjudicate deaths, we found that there was a 20% increase in the evolocumab group of 20% increase in cardiovascular death. So, and this is very similar to the findings in Europe. If you may remember, I already mentioned a 23% increase of cardiovascular mortality in Europe. So we cannot exclude this possibility. And we concluded that a complete restoration is required, and that doctors should be skeptical about the benefits of this drug. So our conclusions are as follows. First, access to regulatory documents and individual patient data is essential to assess drugs. And though some progress has been achieved, researchers should be provided with all available evidence at short notice. There is no ethical or technical reason to hide clinical information. We need more researchers working on RIAD projects to have a real picture on the effects of drugs, and also showcase the need for regulators to release all available evidence. And we also have an important challenge, that is how to incorporate these results to reviews, clinical practice guidelines, and decision-making processes in general. Well, our article in the BMJ Open had some letters to the editors. Some of them were very favorable, some others were not. But this was the very first case that we could hear from Dr. Sabatin, who's the first author of the original publication. And in these letters, he said that our pre-analysis was fundamentally flawed, using incomplete data to reach incorrect conclusions. He also said that the event adjudication followed a rigorous, pre-specified blinded process by the TIMI Clinical Events Committee. In the trial, that there was a full dossier containing all relevant and available source of documents, including hospital notes, laboratory, echocardiograms, imaging data, procedure reports, resuscitation report summaries, death certificates, and autopsy reports. And that the author's work, so that means our work, was post hoc and relied only on one document, that was the clinical story report narratives. So our response was like this. We had requested additional information from Dr. Sabatin on 3 different occasions, and no information was released. Our re-adjudication of deaths was done exclusively by a panel of 5 blinded re-adjudicators. Readers can double-check all re-adjudications made, the justification, read the original narratives in the clinical story report that support all decisions taken. Dr. Sabatin mentioned that they had autopsies, but in the trial protocol, there's no mention to autopsies, and which is more, in the clinical story report, there's only 2 paragraphs where there's a mention to autopsies, just to let readers know that no autopsies were carried out. And we also applied a very conservative approach and re-adjudicated the cause of death only if there was compelling evidence in the clinical story report to support changes. So this is all. Thank you so much. I want to thank especially to all my friends from Therapeutics Initiative at UBC, my dear colleagues from Spain, and also all our colleagues from the University of Maryland for the support to this kind of research work, which is really important.
I promised I'm going to recognize Daniel Clinton, who's a registered nurse in Massachusetts first.
So thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciated it. I guess I read Furrier, and even before learning about the re-adjudication, what jumped out to me was the higher cardiovascular and all-cause mortality that was totally brushed over, and it was published with positive commentaries. And there's video of these people at a conference saying, I wish we could put it in the water. And I'm going, more patients died, and it gave a 1.5% absolute risk reduction in a composite endpoint. I was like, what planet am I on? Then I found your paper and stuff kind of started to click. So it was very helpful. My question, I guess, most directly to you is, what data specifically do you feel TIMI should release to allow an independent re-adjudication? And I'm very concerned because Fourier-Olay is continuing to be used to justify these increasingly low LDL targets that are really only attainable with a PCSK9. And as you noted, Fourier's being used to justify safety for this whole class. There aren't studies on inclisiran. And I'm very fearful that there's a lot of iatrogenic harm chasing a surrogate marker here. So I'd like to know what data you think should TIMI should release to you. And I will be writing to New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know if there's anything we can do that I really think they should either retract Fourier or they should be required to provide people making a thoughtful, peer-reviewed criticism of their work, the primary data.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. I agree with you that we're living tough times, and there's a lot of post-truth in our world nowadays. And if you keep repeating lies, they turn out to be truth for many people. And this is the way it works. And regarding to what information should be released, I think there's no grounds, no legal reason to hide any information. I mean, the clinical study report should be automatically released and redacted, because in many cases there are reductions that hamper you from obtaining very valuable information. And also individual patient data should be released by default. I don't understand why you can get access to individual patient data of the trial if that was funded by a public institution in the United States, and if not, you cannot get it. If you get it from a publicly funded trial, that means there's no ethical nor legal excuse to render this information. So we should strive for getting access to both clinical study reports and individual patient data. This is very useful information, and you can have such a different picture about the drugs' efficacy and safety. And I think these both documents should be released. And I also think it is important to get access to inspection reports. There's a landmark paper by Dr. What's his name? Charles Safe, published in the JAMA Journal, that there's the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, and through this act, he obtained information from different trials, inspections, and he published all this in the American Journal of in the JAMA Journal, and it was heartbreaking to see that some drugs were widely used nowadays, like anticoagulant drugs. In their pivotal trials, there was a lot of misreporting, a lot of fraud, a lot of fake data, but nothing happened. But this was the case of a very sporadic inspection, sporadic publication in a medical journal. But if we had access to all, on a regular basis or more openly, to all inspection reports, we could learn very valuable information about the drugs we're using nowadays.
Thank
Well,
you, that's
there's a
very
question-
helpful.
Excuse me, down there. Dan asked a question earlier, which was reinforced by Tanya Jackson at the University of Alberta, which is what do you think is a reasonable re-adjudication rate, and what is average for a similar study? I guess he's asking how many of the cases adjudicated originally should be re-adjudicated to as a sample.
Well, yeah, that is very difficult to tell, because first you have to get access to the clinical study report, because that's the only way to learn if, well, to suspect if there's grounds for re-adjudication. Because if you feel there's important discrepancies between the published data in the medical journal and what you're reading in the clinical study report, then you can go for that. So it is really difficult to tell, but my guess is that many more cases than thought or expected should be restored.
Joseph Klein, I was just about to ask where Joseph is, but he can maybe put it into the to everyone, let us know where he is. From Europe, he says, could Cochrane reviews of the future necessarily include restorations of patient data?
Oh yeah, definitely. I fully agree with that comment. It is essential, but not only Cochrane reviews. Any evidence-based report should consider the results of re-adjudications. And one, as you may already know, I also belong to the Cochrane collaboration, and one of the pending issues in Cochrane is just to provide an easy access to all these kind of issues in trials, restoration, trials with an expression of concern, and all this should be incorporated to the reviews. Definitely, I fully agree with it.
One thing, I'm not seeing further questions at the moment, so if anyone's asked one that hasn't been addressed, please just put it back in the chat. I'm watching for that. But one thing we learned through therapeutics initiative work, and we were involved in a re-adjudication of the RELY trial of dabigatran in atrial fibrillation, which our work unfortunately could never be published because it was part of a multi-district lawsuit in the United States where the court sealed the whole process and the findings. But I re-adjudicated 1,320 outcomes. And I learned something very important from that, which is that the definition of an event is critically important. And this, I've recently been looking at the re-adjudication of the record trial of rosiglitazone. The re-adjudication was published in the American Heart Journal in 2013. Record was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009, and in preliminary results in the Lancet in 2007. And in all of these, the definition was very important. In Record, part of the issue was, would a silent myocardial infarction be considered a myocardial infarction or not? And there's, as far as I can tell, a consensus that silent myocardial infarctions are clinically quite significant in their, at least, future implications. And I also learned in the RELY trial that the definition of a major or life-threatening cardiovascular bleed, a gastrointestinal bleed, the definition of a major or life-threatening gastrointestinal bleed has nothing to do with what a reasonable clinician would consider major or life-threatening. It's purely numerical. So, for example, a drop in hemoglobin after major orthopedic surgery, like a hip reconstruction, which is essentially universal, especially during the era when people were getting prophylactic anticoagulation, is considered, if it's 40 grams per liter or more, it's considered life-threatening, which is absurd. It would never be transfused in a reasonable hospital, so it can't be life-threatening. So there are all these things that one can learn. I'm just looking if Joseph Klein is in chemistry and a different field. And Dan Clinton is asking again, do you think we should still weigh the increased mortality in the treatment group at the trial's end? It didn't reach statistical significance, but Fourier trial was stopped early. Any comment on that one?
Yeah, that is a really good point. You know, the trial was early stopped, but according to our re-adjudication, maybe shouldn't have been stopped because the number of events, cardiovascular events, you know, cardiovascular mortality was part of the composite outcome. And we found that the number of cardiovascular deaths was artificially increased. And this contributed to the justification of stopping the trial. What we found was that at that point, there was a 20% increase in cardiovascular mortality. If this proportion was steady, by the time the trial had reached to the originally scheduled duration, statistically significant difference could have been found in the evolocumab group, meaning patients under evolocumab could have reached or could have statistically higher mortality rates than the placebo group. So, but we'll never know because the trial was stopped. So we cannot rule out the possibility that in the long run, this drug could increase cardiovascular mortality. We simply don't know. But there's a possibility, and this should be explored.
I think, there's one more from Daniel Clinton. Would you like to ask this yourself, Daniel, if we can turn you back on?
And you answered my question. I've seen some people dismiss the increased mortality at cessation by saying, well, it wasn't statistically significant. And I say, but they stopped it early. Isn't that cheating? If death is trending towards statistical significance when a trial is stopped early, I just as a nurse, my concern is as a patient advocate, there's no way to exclude direct iatrogenic harm. And it just seems paradoxical to give a drug associated with increased cardiovascular and all-cause mortality to treat and prevent cardiovascular disease. I feel like the results of Fourier were just completely misinterpreted by its authors, and somehow the significance of more death isn't being registered by these people.
Well, you raise a very important point. I think there's another question in the chat, more or less the same. Yeah, when it comes to early stop of trials, we should always take it with a pinch of salt. You know, I remember there was a very interesting study that compared cardiovascular clinical trials that had stopped early with those that hadn't stopped early, and authors concluded that early stopping produced a 30% increase in in efficacy, a fake 30% increase in efficacy. And trials that are early stopped, well, it should be taken, as I was saying, with a pinch of salt, and because the stopping trials will distort results to a great extent, and this 30% difference in many cases is high enough to reach statistically significant difference when there's no differences, or to change the direction of evidence. So we should be very cautious about early stoppage of trials. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Well, one of our colleagues would like to ask a question. Go ahead, Shazad.
Hi, thank you for your presentation again. There was a slide about the interaction across different regions for outcomes. For different outcomes, I'm not completely clear about that, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on that to explain what variables did have interactions, because I noticed the p-value was significant for some of them. Thank you, I appreciate it.
So then, well, this is a comparison between Europe and North America, these subgroups. And in the case of the composite outcome, the main outcome, there was interaction. This is the p interaction for subgroups. And you know, if it is lower than 0.01, there's interaction. And if it is between 0.01 and 0.05, there's possible interaction. So for the composite outcome, there was interaction. So there was significant differences between subgroups. And for cardiovascular death and myocardial infarction, there was possible interaction. That we could say there was interaction. It is really close to the limit of interaction, 0.01. And for the all-cause mortality outcome, there was also possible interaction, p is less than 0.05, between Europe and North America. So this is very, very surprising. This is such a different behavior between Europe and North America. This is far-fetched to say that this can be explained because of race issues or.
Well, I think you've been very patient with us. I have just one final question before we let you go get your dinner and a glass of good Pinto. What would you say to anyone who's watching this? And I expect quite a few people will watch it online as the recording. What would you say to them if they're contemplating applying to do a RIOT project? One, about the funding, and two, the amount of work, because this has been a huge amount of work for you.
That is a good issue, a really important issue. Well, this is passionate kind of research work, and if anyone is interested in starting one of these kind of projects, he or she should know that there will be grants. The University of Maryland offers some grants to do this kind of research, but not only money, they also offer themselves for tuition, for technical support, and everything for free. And our colleagues from Maryland, Peter Doshi, and colleagues are very helpful and very, very kind to all researchers doing this kind of job. So, well, in my slides, there's a link to the website of the RIOT Support Center in Maryland. So anyone interested can go through it and learn more. And they have a website where everything is explained, and they're very nice guys, and you can contact them. And well, and in any case, they can contact me too, as was an experienced researcher on this kind of issues.
Can you remind us also, did you consider at one point submitting the manuscript for your research to the New England Journal of Medicine?
Oh yes, we did, but we had no reply. And well, we thought that first we should try the New England and approach the journal where this publication was originally published, let them know that we wanted to restore the trial and give them the opportunity of doing it by themselves. But we were never responded, and after many months, then we decided to approach a different journal. There's a list of so-called riot-friendly journals. This is important to know too. And there's the BMJ plus one and some journals that are friendly to this kind of research. And it would be nice that we had more and more journals friendly to this all these issues. Yeah, I don't want to discourage anyone. You may think this is a painstaking job, but I think well, in the case of the Fourier trial, because of the complexity and the number of patients, it took us quite an effort to go through. But there will be some other trials which are much easier. And we have the case of another trial that we restored that was very simple and very easy to do compared to the Fourier trial. So, and then we should also think that the very first time you do whatever you do, it is you may feel it like a burden or something unachievable. But once you do it the first time, then you learn and everything becomes easier. So it is a matter of just going through.
Well, you make it look easy, a lot easier than it was, Juan. A beautiful presentation. I'd like to thank all of the audience for sticking with us, and remind you our next webinar is 1 week from today on meta-analysis of diagnostic methods, and then our next event is June 14th, the third in the deprescribing webinar series. Thank you everyone for joining us, and